August 9th, 1989. Stubai Glacier Ski Resort, Austria. Nestled 10,000 feet above sea level sits the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort in the illustrious Austrian Alps, and guaranteeing snow from October to May, the glacier presents itself as a major beacon of winter fun and a major tourist attraction even all year round. However, it is not all just fun and snow at the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort. Duncan MacPherson, a former highly touted hockey prospect and even a first-round pick of the New York Islanders, would visit the resort to get some snowboarding lessons only to disappear from the side of the glacier. For over a decade, Duncan's story was more than cold, colder than the slopes he disappeared on. That was until 14 years later, after his disappearance, his body would be found on that very glacier, and the state in which he was found in was extremely gruesome. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we explore a case of a young man in his pursuit to start a new career for himself, only for it to end in tragedy before it ever began. Is there more than meets the eye when it comes to the tragic disappearance and death of Duncan MacPherson? And could there be something more at play than what the police in the ski resort care to disclose? Today on the show, we investigate the unfortunate story of Duncan MacPherson. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and if you're checking out this show on YouTube or Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. If you are listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out with the algorithm, and I greatly appreciate it. And while you're doing that, feel free to go ahead and follow me on Instagram and TikTok at the same handle, Unblurring the Unknown, and you'll stay up to loop with everything that has to do with this show. And again, I greatly appreciate it. Now, today on the show, we are diving into a not very well-known crime case that is both very fascinating, but also very sad, and honestly, kind of gruesome. Now, just a disclaimer before we dive into this episode, we are going to be talking about a person whose body was in an advanced state of decomposition when they were found, and the pure extent of the injuries were extremely gruesome, and for the sake of the theories surrounding Duncan's death, I do feel like it is important that we dive into those injuries because of the implications they have on our theories and the manner of death that may have happened or believe that might have happened. And because of that, we're going to be talking about a lot of things, especially in regards to the body of Duncan. So I do want to mention listener discretion is advised throughout pieces of this episode. However, if that does not bother you in any way, shape, or form, that works for me. I just wanted to let you all know that just ahead of time before we eventually dive into it. Now, this case is technically classified as solved currently, and the case is not open. However, the way in which this case was handled is very suspicious, and has left the door open to different explorations into this case in the supposed cause of death of Duncan MacPherson. But with that being said, how today's episode is going to go is that we are first going to dive into a little bit of Duncan's upbringing, his backstory, and his hockey career, and then the sequence of events that eventually led him to Austria, where he would unfortunately pass away, and then we are going to go into the investigation afterwards, and then wrap it up with theories that we have about his death, and my own personal thoughts and opinions on this entire case. But with that being said, let's dive into the story and the unfortunate end of Duncan MacPherson. Duncan MacPherson was born on February 3rd, 1966 in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada. From a very early age, Duncan displayed a passion and a love for hockey, but also independence. His mother, Linda, and his father, Bob, would describe that Duncan would ride the bus by himself when he was just 3 years old, like it was a very normal thing. And of course, if you know anything about children, that isn't particularly common. Duncan was also described as fearless when it came to his day-to-day life, and believe it or not, that is a trait that is very important when it comes to ice hockey. Duncan played hockey religiously, and eventually as a young teenager would join the Saskatoon Blades hockey team in his hometown of Saskatoon. Now, Duncan's physical style of play would eventually get the attention of NHL scouts. Now, if you are unfamiliar with what the NHL is, the NHL, the National Hockey League, is widely regarded as the highest level of professional hockey one can play in. Now, unlike the NFL, where kids or prospects are often plucked right out of school and immediately play, the NHL doesn't work that way. Very often, if you aren't a top 3 pick within the first round of the draft, at this point, you would only be 18 years old in the NHL draft, as opposed to college kids when they get drafted into the NFL. They're much older than 18. 18-year-old prospects, in the case of the NHL, very rarely hit the ice until years later. Now, it isn't uncommon during this time period for when you are drafted as a 17, 18-year-old kid to bounce around many different minor leagues or even play in college for years before one ever sees any time with the big league club. Now, I just wanted to explain that if some of you aren't super in tune with sports, so we understand how that whole concept works. Now, Duncan's physicality on the ice would cause him to get noticed by NHL scouts, and keep in mind, this was in the 1980s at this time. Big physical defensemen were an integral part of the game, and they still are in today's game, but not nearly as much as they were in the 2020s. The game has evolved more into a skill battle, where players skate faster than they ever did before, and having a good offensive skill set is often more sought after than just hitting guys and playing good defense in some cases. However, one team decided to take a very long look at MacPherson, and this team in particular would be the New York Islanders, who loved Duncan's style of play and thought he would be a great addition to the franchise. They loved him so much so that in the 1984 NHL entry draft, the New York Islanders would select Duncan with their 20th overall pick in the first round. Of course, this would be a huge deal for Duncan and his family, and becoming a professional hockey player was a dream come true, and him and his family could not be more excited for the opportunity. However, unfortunately, getting drafted doesn't always translate to instant success. Even though Duncan was drafted in the first round, he bounced around in New York's minor league system in Springfield in the AHL and Indianapolis in the IHL while trying to play hard and crack the major league team's roster. Duncan would unfortunately suffer injury after injury, most likely caused by his physical style of play. Over the 4 years since getting drafted, Duncan would have suffered injuries to both of his knees, a torn rotator cuff, and even suffer a major leg injury that would cause him to be constantly set back from reaching his ultimate goal of making the NHL roster. And while he was loved in basically every city he played in because of his unrelenting and physical style of play, unfortunately, availability is the best ability, and the Islanders started to look at Duncan as perhaps a liability more than a possibility. 4 years later, after being drafted 20th overall, Duncan was cut by the New York Islanders. His dream was ultimately crushed, and while his injury-prone nature made him a tough sell for other major league teams, Duncan was now forced to start looking elsewhere for a career that he spent basically his entire life chasing. Duncan, who would be 23 at this time, would find himself staying within the world of professional hockey and become acquainted with a man named Ron Dixon. Dixon, who had just purchased a semi-professional hockey team in Dundee, Scotland, named the Tigers. Now, the reason Duncan and Dixon became affiliated with each other is that Dixon was actually interested in hiring Duncan to act as a coach for the team and possibly a part-time player. Now, this seemed like a perfect fit for Duncan, as this allowed him to see Europe and stay within the realm of professional hockey and not have to leave it altogether. Duncan was very interested in the job, and Dixon had eventually scheduled a meeting between the two on Saturday, August 12th, 1989. They planned on signing a contract that day, and Duncan would become part of the team and would start that following Monday. It would be safe to say this would be a big change for Duncan, going from Canada to now being a player-coach in Scotland, but needless to say, Duncan wanted to start his transition from Canada to Europe rather soon. And Duncan at this point decided that he wanted to leave for Europe and take the time to visit some friends overseas that he had made while playing professionally in Saskatoon and in the minor leagues of the NHL. Now, he would do this on August 2nd, 1989, and he would spend time traveling to multiple different countries in Europe. On August 4th, 1989, Duncan would visit a friend of his named George in Nuremberg, Germany. He would spend the next couple days with George, and on Monday the 7th, Duncan would borrow George's car, a red Corso hatchback, which happens to be a small front-wheel drive car. And Duncan's plan was to use George's car to visit a few places around the country before his interview that Saturday back in Scotland, and eventually before that he would return the car to George, of course, before leaving for Scotland and his interview. Now, Duncan would drive 3 hours south to Füssen, Germany, to visit another friend, and he would leave there on the 8th. Now, at some point over this series of days of where Duncan's kind of hopping back and forth between seeing friends in Germany, Duncan would call and chat with Ron Dixon and state that he was still planning on showing up for the interview and meeting that they had together and getting started with the new job, and that he was very excited for it. However, when August 12th would arrive, Duncan did not show up at the scheduled meeting with Ron Dixon. This would immediately set off a red flag in the head of Ron Dixon, who thought for sure Duncan was going to show up and that he wasn't going to get cold feet. He felt concerned about Duncan not showing up and not saying anything about his change of heart, so at this point Dixon would decide to contact Duncan's parents, and the three of them would eventually report Duncan missing on the 20th of August. And of course, no one had heard anything from Duncan since he seemingly vanished on the 8th. His parents would even fly out to Europe on the 27th of August to assist with the search for Duncan. However, it would be just under a month later when Duncan's parents would learn that the Opel Corso that Duncan was driving, lent to him by his friend George, was actually found parked at the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort in Austria. This would be 90 miles south of Füssen, Germany. Now, during the police's investigation into the disappearance of Duncan, a timeline would start to emerge. On August 9th, 1989, Duncan would arrive at the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort, and by all assumptions, it seemed like Duncan went to the glacier to go engage in a little snowboarding before his interview and perhaps go do something he always wanted to do, and took the opportunity to do so since he was already exploring Germany and Europe before his interview. A worker named Walter would state that Duncan would have snowboarding lessons that day, the 9th, and Duncan would rent a snowboard from the resort. Duncan, by all accounts, would head out for his lesson, and after his lesson, his sweater and turtleneck were very wet from the slopes, and Walter said that he actually allowed Duncan to hang these articles of clothing up in his office. Duncan would then purchase a sweatshirt from the resort because his clothes were so wet from the slopes. Duncan would have lunch with Walter at the resort, and Duncan would head back out onto the slopes by himself after lunch, seemingly trying to get some more runs in by himself post his lesson that morning, which makes a lot of sense. Now, Walter's girlfriend, who I could not find a name for, who also worked at the resort, stated that she saw Duncan using the T-bar lift at the resort at around 2:30 that afternoon, meaning that he had stayed probably for the rest of the day at the resort and going on runs down the slope by himself. Now, this supposedly would be the last time anyone would see Duncan alive. Now, at the end of the day, Walter had noticed that Duncan's clothing was still hanging in his office, and he thought this was odd, but not entirely, as Duncan had stated that he was going to be returning the following day for another lesson, so Walter disregarded it. This would be the first fatal flaw. In addition, the rental shop stated that all snowboards were accounted for at the end of the day, making it seem like Duncan had actually left for the day and that he just happened to leave the resort. However, this would not be true, as his car was still out in the parking lot. This would be the second fatal flaw. Under the assumption that Duncan had left, of course, the perspective from the ski resort staff is that they probably didn't lose much sleep over this. However, it should have stood out to them that Duncan's car was still in the parking lot, and coupled with his clothes still being there, this should have struck everybody as odd and raised some alarm bells. However, no one even batted an eye. Now, the resort was accessed either by gondola or by hiking up the mountain to the lodge, where you could then take lifts up to different parts of the glacier to ski. Now, because of this, and knowing that the ski resort is only accessible by gondola or hiking up the mountain, the police would have naturally assumed that maybe Duncan tried to hike back down the mountain to return to the parking lot and got lost that way. Now, they would have assumed this again because by all of the information they had available to them, the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort staff said that the snowboard was returned, making them feel like Duncan was not on the mountain. And that's why they started to lean towards the idea that maybe Duncan had disappeared at some other portion of the resort, but not the actual ski area. Now, they started to search and they would shift their attention to, again, of course, maybe Duncan disappeared while hiking down the mountain at some point. However, they searched the ski resort pretty frequently over the next 3 days, and no one was able to find Duncan whatsoever. Now, even post this, Duncan's parents would continue to make trips to Austria to try and search for Duncan. However, they would have no luck, and it would not take very long for this entire case to turn very, very cold, as it had seemed like Duncan had just completely vanished off the face of the earth. Now, like I said, Duncan's case would go cold for years, and it wouldn't be until 14 years later where a development would finally be made in the case. On July 18th, 2003, 14 years after Duncan went missing, there would be a major break in the case. At around 3 p.m. that afternoon, the workers of the ski resort would call the police and state they found a corpse on the glacier. This body, of course, would belong to Duncan MacPherson. His body would be found about 82 feet east of the T-bar lift and would be found in a shallow crevasse within the glacier. Police originally stated that the body was found much farther away from the ski area, which was false, and initially painted a picture that this could have been Duncan's fault, and that he wandered well past the designated ski area. However, like I said, that information was false and not true. Now, the remains of Duncan were extremely gruesome, and the state in which his body was found was shocking to say the least. Both of his forearms and hands were amputated, and his left leg was amputated below and above his knee. The lower portion of his leg was completely destroyed. His injuries were sharp and linear, and in addition to that, the snowboard that Duncan had rented had been found near the body and had similar straight slices, like it was cut apart or had been struck by some type of metal machinery, which of course further deepens this mystery. Now, even though Duncan's death seemed very strange, the police did not want to conduct an autopsy, and overall, the investigators handled this case very lackadaisical. They thought that the death of Duncan was easily explained, and that Duncan had fallen into this shallow crevasse and froze to death, and that the extreme state in which his body was found in was due to being trapped within the ice in the glacier for so long. In fact, his body moved a little over 100 feet down the mountain glacier over the course of the 14 years, and that possibly could have caused the damage to his body. The force and pressure from the glacier moving and grinding into each other could have caused the damage to the body, and it is very, very possible this could be the case. And on the surface, this could be explainable as to why Duncan's body was so mangled. Now, you might be thinking, how is that possible? But the strength of Mother Nature knows no bounds, and from the police's standpoint, there was no other possibility. They saw this as an unfortunate accident, and the case closed. However, not everyone is convinced by this belief of the police, and neither am I. Now, with this all being said, I want you to kind of paint the picture, of course, of what we have just talked about. They found Duncan's body in a shallow crevasse about 100 feet down the mountain from where they suspected he originally disappeared. Obviously, his body was in very, very rough conditions, and they thought that it was possible that he had, of course, froze to death, and of course, the glacier kind of freezes and melts, and it is very possible for when something gets trapped within the glacier, the immense force and pressure of the ice smashing against each other, it is very easy for that to tear a body apart, and science pretty much knows this. So, of course, when the police find Duncan's body, this is what they automatically assume, and since it had been 14 years and they just found Duncan, they called it case closed. And like I said, there was no autopsy performed, there was no cause of death officially determined, there was just the official explanation of he fell in the crevasse, he probably froze to death, and his body is so badly mangled because he got smashed from the glacier. However, not everybody believes that theory, and like I said, neither do I. And this kind of leads us now into an extended theories section that they kind of intersect and web between each other. And I'm going to kind of explain how it does that, especially in the other main theory we have proposed. Of course, we have this glacier theory that Duncan was trapped within the glacier, and that's how his body was so badly mangled. However, we have another theory, and there's a bunch of little theories that offshoot that, like I mentioned, that kind of intersect and web between each other. So let's dive into that, shall we? Now, the other big theory proposed, and this is glacier theory, the other big theory. Now, the other big theory is the snow groomer theory, or the snowcat theory. And this theory, which is widely discussed and widely believed, and I do apologize because this is going to be a very long theory because I have to explain to you why I like this theory and why there's facts to support this theory. Now, this theory, like I said, that is widely believed, was that Duncan did not fall into a crevasse and then his body then mangled by moving ice, but rather Duncan was run over by a snowcat on the mountain. Now, if you don't know what a snowcat is or what a snow groomer is, it's basically like this giant tractor is the best thing I can describe it as. It is basically this giant tractor. It is operating on treads that you can use to go up and down the mountain. There are two sets of basically tillers, one on the back and one on the front, that grooms the ski mountain and grooms the trails, so they're nice, they're packed down for skiers and snowboarders to enjoy the mountain. Now, just in case you did not know what a snowcat was or what a snow groomer was, and if you happen to live in a southern state that was not hit by this massive storm, this massive winter storm that we just got, and you happen to live in a place that doesn't have any snow, that's what a snowcat does at a ski resort. Now, like I said, this theory was that Duncan happened to be run over by one of these snowcats. Now, the main theory that the main branch of this theory is that Duncan was on the ski slope and he had either somehow managed to injure himself while on the slopes or was taking a break of some sort. And let's just say he happened to injure himself for the sake of this theory. Now, this would say Duncan managed to injure himself while up on the mountain, and this would cause him to be up there on the mountain past closing time waiting for help. Now, while up there, the snowcats, like I mentioned, used for grooming ski resort trails, could be going down the glacier after the resort closed. Now, the weather on that day was foggy with a slight drizzle, making visibility very, very poor on the glacier. Now, the snowcat driver perhaps mistakenly did not see Duncan on the slope through the fog and accidentally ran over Duncan, not with the snowcat tracks itself, but rather caught Duncan's leg in the tiller, or within the gears of the snowcat treads, and thus sucked his arms and body into the machine, causing the amputations and severe state in which the body was found. Now, the other side of this theory was that after possibly realizing what had happened, the snowcat driver presumably would discover that he or she had run over Duncan by accident and decided to avoid persecution, perhaps from negligence, and this driver would then hide the body by putting it in the shallow crevasse. Now, of course, this is a huge accusation, however, the evidence points in that direction. Now, the police, however, at this time chose to ignore the evidence found with the body's discovery because even if there was foul play and it was deemed to be negligent homicide, the statute of limitations would unfortunately have been expired at that point, and it would have opened a whole new can of worms into tracking down who the snowcat driver was that night and then trying to pursue criminal charges that ultimately couldn't be pressed because the statute of limitations had expired. So it was kind of starting this whole new issue when they didn't need to make it. So they just decided, we're going to close it. Even if it's suspicious, we're just, case closed. Which again, however, in my opinion, even that mindset is negligent. And the police were negligent in not doing their job. But I guess from their perspective, there was nothing else to do or nothing else to solve after they had found the body. However, questions remain regardless with this theory. Why did the resort not think that there was something wrong when Duncan's car remained in the parking lot overnight? Why did the rental shop think that the snowboard was returned when it clearly was not, and it was found with his body? This has spread further rumors that perhaps the ski resort knew that the accident took place, and it was complacent with the accident. Now, that is even more significant of an accusation than just the snowcat driver killing Duncan through negligence. Now, perhaps Duncan had been struck by the snowcat post-death, meaning perhaps Duncan had frozen to death before being stuck in the groomer, but that would be kind of hard to tell. And as we kind of go into the extent of his injuries, I'm going to explain why I feel like Duncan was struck by the snow groomer while he was still alive. Now, in Duncan's wallet, they happened to find most of his credit cards and other forms of ID, except for his driver's license. Now, why do I emphasize that? And why is that important to note that Duncan did not have his driver's license on him? Let me tell you. The driver's license would be a common item for the ski resort to keep when renting out a rental equipment or a piece of rental equipment to ensure that the renter would bring the rented equipment back. It's the same concept when you go into a bar and open up a tab, so it's at the end of the day, you paid and you didn't just run off with, drinking all the booze and just having to dine and dash. It's essentially the same exact thing. Now, why would the ski resort claim that all of the rented snowboards and skis were retrieved for the day if Duncan's ID could have still been at the rental shop? It would have been pretty telling that Duncan was still on the mountain in some capacity if he did not come back to retrieve his driver's license. Now, I was able to find many pictures of the remains of Duncan MacPherson through the website of an author named John Leake, in the book he wrote about the mystery and death of Duncan MacPherson. Now, John Leake goes to the full extent and sees multiple different scientific experts to help prove the theory that Duncan was actually the victim of a snowcat accident and not freezing and subsequently getting ripped apart by moving glacial ice. Now, if you would like to see the photos of those corpses, you are more than welcome to do so. However, they are pretty gruesome, so please have a thick stomach before you looked at them. I looked at them, and it's pretty grisly, and I want to emphasize that they're probably some of the more grisly photographs that I have seen. Of course, it's a corpse. Of course, it was kind of preserved by ice, so you don't see, any blood or anything like that. But seeing the body parts of another human being is kind of a little unsettling. So if you don't do good with that kind of things, just kind of take my word for it. It was really bad. Now, like I mentioned, there is a website to see those photos, and I will share it with you here in a little bit. But Dr. Walter Rabel of the Innsbruck Institute of Forensic Medicine, and John Leake documents this as well, he was tasked with not doing an autopsy of the body, but he was tasked with testing the body for identification to make sure it was Duncan. Now, the official explanation Dr. Rabel was given was that Duncan's body had been mashed by moving glacier ice, and while Dr. Rabel was not doing the autopsy and none was ever performed, it on the surface didn't initially sit right for him. For starters, the injuries were not consistent with that caused by moving glaciers. The following is what he had noticed about the remains. Of course, Duncan's hands and forearms were both amputated. His left leg had been amputated above and below his knee, with the lower portion of his leg being completely destroyed beyond recognition. His right leg was still attached to his body and did not share this similar type of injury. Now, how could glacial flow smash one leg into literal pieces and leave the other one completely untouched? In addition to all the fractures found in Duncan's bones, sections of his skin had been ground, torn off, and degloved. Now, if you don't know what degloved skin is, it is basically where the skin is literally pulled off of the muscle itself. Now, to say that, it is pretty brutal. And that is the type of bodily injury that is not something that is consistent with glacier ice injuries, and rather more consistent with injuries we see of body parts getting stuck in rotating metal machinery. In addition, Duncan's clothing was shredded and torn, and his limbs and body parts were found next to his body. If affected by glacial ice, the force of the ice alone would pull his body parts away from his body, and they shouldn't be found basically right on top of each other, but rather away from it, and separated his limbs into different directions along the glacier. Now, John Leake would take all of this injury information and share it with forensic anthropologist Miriam Nafty, criminalist Lynn Harold, and glaciologist David Evans, and they all said that the injuries presented were not that caused by moving ice and glacial movement, but rather rotating machinery. They thought his injuries were more consistent with that. Now, the MacPherson family did a lot of legwork too, no pun intended whatsoever, to try and figure out what truly happened to their son, because they also didn't buy the glacier theory. Now, upon further investigation of Duncan's body, the snowboard would be recovered as well, which again asks the question of why the resort staff thought it had been returned when it had not. Now, as it turns out, during the recovery of the snowboard from the site of Duncan's remains, the staff of the ski resort tried to use a snow groomer as a sort of winch to get the snowboard out of the ice, which ended up further damaging the snowboard and basically damaging portions of the crime scene, basically, which this doesn't make any sense, because there is, of course, not a winch spot on a snowboard whatsoever. And like I said, it just ended up breaking the board further and becoming more damaged. However, regardless of the resort staff damaging a piece of the crime scene, basically, however, inspection of the snowboard, the board itself had damage consistent with a row of gouge marks, which also happened to be consistent. These gouge marks found on the snowboard happened to be consistent with the spacing of a snowcat tiller, that being the basically rotating metal piece at the front and the back of the snow groomer. Now, also discovered on Duncan's body was a plastic ID card of some sort within his wallet that had a chunk taken out of it. Now, this chunk taken out of this plastic ID card was a perfect match for a snowcat tiller blade. In addition, red residue was also found along the plywood portion of the snowboard Duncan used as well. Now, if you look at the crime scene photos or not really the autopsy photos either, but the photos taken of Duncan's corpse and the snowboard in particular, you can see basically where the paint and the design pattern of the snowboard had been ripped off. And then underneath that, you can see kind of red residue left behind on the plywood that you can see. Now, this red residue basically implies that this must have came from paint or scraping of some sort from a metal machine. This red residue would not have been there if damaged by glacial ice. It's impossible because ice is ice. There's not like red paint within ice. So it doesn't make any sense that you say, oh yeah, the snowboard was trapped within the ice and that's how it broke. Yeah, it could have been broke, but that doesn't explain the consistent pattern of gouge marks. It doesn't explain the chunk taken out of his ID card that happened to be a perfect match for the snowcat tiller blade. And it does not explain the fact that the red residue was kind of left behind on his snowboard that looked like it was basically paint residue. Now, perhaps the biggest indicator of this theory, as if I didn't mention to you 3 separate indicators as to why this theory makes sense, and this is perhaps the largest chunk of evidence supporting the snowcat theory, was the damage to Duncan's left leg. Now, as John Leake was able to compile evidence in his book, there were 3 separate gouge marks right above Duncan's knee that were evenly spaced out. Now, these puncture gouge marks are consistent with the drive gear and locking brackets of the treads of the snowcat. John has diagrams and, of course, the photos of the corpse are on his website, www.coldalongtime.com, and that's the name of his book as well if you want to go out and check that out. And you can see those photos there. But like I said, just a disclaimer, you will also see photos of the corpse of Duncan MacPherson, but you also see the diagrams of where the gouge marks are and kind of the spacing and everything like that, and how everything kind of lines up like I happen to see them. Now, Leake identifies and shows you that there are 2 rows of gouges, one slightly higher than the other on his left leg, where you can make out 3 puncture marks. And again, the chunk of his leg that's in the photo is his knee. And like I said, it was amputated above and below. So you basically have a section of his leg that is a piece of his upper leg, a piece of his lower leg, because the rest of his lower leg was destroyed. And then you have the knee in the middle. And pretty much right along the kneecap, or slightly under it, you have 3 gouge marks that are evenly spaced out. Now, right below that, there are additional gouges, presumably from the drive gear of the snowcat. Meaning the track, and when his left leg was sucked into the machine, the drive gear's rotation would amputate the bottom part of his leg, and then that would be the inside part, or the lower set of gouges. And then the higher set of gouges would be from the bracket gouges, or from the tread mechanisms, the brackets and the tread mechanisms on the upper part of his leg, if that makes sense. Now, to put this into perspective, maybe you all can understand here. Of course, his leg was amputated in 2 different spots. But, for example, if you use a pencil sharpener, you have the tip of the pencil that gets sharpened, and that's one spot. And then at the very end of the pencil sharpener, where you stuck the pencil sharpener into the machine, is where basically the color of the pencil is ground off when you sharpen it. Now compare that to the track mechanisms. The sharpener would be the drive gear, and the spot where the color comes off of your pencil would be the bracket mechanisms of the tread. So basically, you have his leg inside of the drive gear and the bracket mechanisms of the snowcat being punctured in two different spots. And that injury is consistent. And the drive gear and the tread mechanisms, you have two different sets of rotating and moving machinery. This would explain why the leg was gouged in two separate places and amputated in both spots in the middle of the tracks. Like I said, it might be like a pencil sharpens all the way when you stick it all the way in the machine and not at the start of the machine. Now, from this point, it is assumed that Duncan would try to push himself away from the machine. And this is where his hands and forearms would be amputated as well, as they would be sucked into the drive gears and brackets of the track mechanism when he tried to push himself away. Now, this is why I explained why I thought Duncan was alive, because if Duncan happened to be, if he happened to freeze to death or something like that on the mountain and he happened to be run over and his leg was sucked into the machine, I don't believe his arms would have been amputated. I guess it all depends on the placement of his arms, but to me, it makes sense that his leg was sucked into the drive gear and tread mechanisms, and then he attempted to pull himself out, where he probably tried to grab something to push himself off, and his arms just got sucked in the process as well. Now, there is evidence on the body to support this as well as his arms getting sucked in, of course, because they were amputated at the hands and the forearms, which if you kind of do, the process of elimination by yourself, is a similar distance in which his lower leg and his upper leg was severed from his left knee. The distance is similar, kind of implying that possibly, again, his arms got sucked in and then amputated at both spots where his left leg got amputated, the drive gear and then the tread mechanisms on the outside of basically the inside of the moving treads of the snowcat. Now, with this all being said, and as professionals kind of backing this up and stating that his injuries are extremely gruesome and they are more consistent with this type of death or being stuck in a rotating piece of metal machinery rather than being stuck in glacial ice and moved down the hill and crushed that way for a decade. Now, from this point, the side theories kind of branch in. Could it be possible that the worker of the snowcat realized he accidentally ran somebody over and then possibly hid the body in a shallow crevasse in an effort to not get caught? And as in one source I actually found stated that there were other gloves left behind at the scene that did not belong to Duncan MacPherson. So this part of the theory maybe implies that the worker, in an effort to not get caught, he hid Duncan's body in the shallow crevasse and accidentally left a glove behind at the scene. Or could it perhaps have been possible that multiple people helped hide the body for fear of losing their jobs over an accident? Now, I have my own personal thoughts on this, but I will keep them to myself here for just a second. Now, of course, the other theory here is a glacial ice movement theory. Now, like I said, that first theory was a doozy and had a lot of moving parts. But this glacial ice movement theory is pretty much what the police said. And this is the wrong opinion. This is the wrong theory, in my personal opinion. But let's just say the police were right, and Duncan managed to fall into a shallow crevasse while snowboarding and froze to death, and no one found him. Now, regardless of what theory you want to go with, whether it's a glacier being crushed by glacial ice or being run over by a snowcat, the ski resort should be negligent regardless because of his snowboard not being returned, his car still being left at the resort, and his clothes still hanging in the ski resort's office. The ski resort should be at full fault, regardless of the theory, in my personal opinion. Now, while this could have happened, Duncan MacPherson's injuries don't tell that story. Most of the injuries we just went over in the previous theory were extremely gruesome and were more consistent with being trapped within machinery of some sort, and the only machinery that would have been large enough to inflict that type of damage and the gouge marks on Duncan's leg was consistent with that of snowcat drive gears in the interior track mechanism. The police in this nature were also negligent and called this case closed because the body had been found and the statute of limitations had expired. So, of course, they called it case closed rather than looking for the true story to give Bob and Linda MacPherson some type of closure to their son's death. So there are multiple moving pieces here. There are multiple parties that are at fault in some degree. The ski resort, the police for not trying to uncover the full story of what actually went on here, even though it is unfortunately case closed. Now, in my opinion, I fully believed that Duncan, even though this is not the official explanation given by the police, I do believe that Duncan had been run over by the snowcat. And I think that Duncan was on the slopes that day, and maybe he had hurt himself, or maybe he was resting on the slopes, not realizing the resort had closed for the day. And with the bad weather, the snowcat driver was coming down the slopes, did not see Duncan because of the foggy weather, and happened to strike Duncan in the leg and snowboard. Now, if Duncan was resting, or if he happened to injure himself, it could be very well possible that he took one foot or one leg out of the binding of the snowboard, and the other leg was resting outside of the bindings. Now, I don't know which might be the case. I do think it is possible that perhaps the snowboard was on his left leg, and that is why it kind of gotten sucked into the machine. The board got pulled in first, and then his leg kind of went with it, and that being the reason why his right leg was unaffected by damage, because maybe if he had his right leg in the snowboard, maybe his right leg would have been damaged as opposed to his left leg. Now, of course, in my personal theory, perhaps, like I said, his snowboard got hit first and then subsequently sucked his leg into the drive gear and tread mechanisms, and Duncan would try to push himself away from the snowcat using his right leg, which I'm assuming he would try to keep away, and he's pushing against the snow, trying to push backwards, and he's trying to use his arms to push off the machine and trying to push himself away, and that's where his arms would be sucked into the machine as well. Now, I have to imagine once his leg was amputated, not counting the blood loss from his arms as well, you would have roughly 2 minutes from what I was able to find online in terms of research until he would have bled out from his injuries, if he didn't happen to pass away from sheer blood loss when both of his arms were amputated to begin with, as the 2 minutes from what I could found only represents if you happen to sever basically a leg artery. You have 2 minutes before you're probably going to die from blood loss. So it's more than likely Duncan had less than 2 minutes from the damage to his forearms and his leg in terms of he would have lost too much blood and he would have bled out from his injuries. Now, I think the snowcat driver may be distracted or impaired to some degree, did not see the slope or did not see Duncan because of the weather conditions, and assuming it was past closing, of course, the driver did not think that anyone would still be out on the slope, only to realize their mistake after the fact. And realizing that they had made a crucial, critical mistake once they heard screaming or panicked, and they stopped the machine after running Duncan over. Now, I am assuming once exiting the snowcat and realizing their awful mistake, Duncan unfortunately would have passed away or would have been just barely alive at this point. And I think he was probably passed away at this point. I think the driver would panic, and from the sources I found saying actually multiple sets of gloves were found at the scene that did not belong to Duncan, I think that the snowcat driver rightfully panicked and got in touch with a coworker or a friend that helped move the body of Duncan into the shallow crevasse to protect the snowcat driver from losing their job or being arrested if they were truly negligent or impaired through alcohol or other substances. They would take the gloves off after moving the body, which could have been very bloody or something like that. Now, the information about the bloody gloves, I am assuming, because I did not find anything that said that the blood recovered, or the gloves, recovered at the scene had blood on them or anything like that. I just found sources that say that there was gloves there. I don't know if this is confirmed or if this is just rumor or whatever it is, but I do think regardless of the gloves being there, I do think that the snowcat driver ran over Duncan and probably had help to move his body into the shallow crevasse. And they did this, of course, to keep any of the evidence of the accident hidden from their coworkers or bosses. Now, this is what I think most likely happened, and it is extremely unfortunate that although we found Duncan and his body, what we think happened to him, and the fact that the police chose to not investigate this further, really irks my bones, and makes this entire story more sad and more unresolved than it needs to be overall. Now, this is a true crime story that I feel like needs to be talked about more. It is perhaps more of an uncharacteristic story when it comes to the overall story and the cause of death, and it is very sad. But overall, I felt like this episode, or this kind of subject we went over today, albeit very, like I said, kind of sad and troubling to go over, was a good palate cleanser from the fact that we've been talking about Mothman for the past 4 weeks plus. So I feel like this was a good kind of U-turn for us to take and get back to kind of the regular episodes you're used to. Because, like I said, we just covered the Mothman for about 4 to 5 weeks. So a good palate cleanser is sometimes always needed. Now, my last final thoughts when it comes to the story of Duncan MacPherson is that maybe, do I think that there was a massive cover-up here where, the ski resort had realized that their worker had made some type of fatal flaw or fatal mistake and had caused the accident and had accidentally run over Duncan MacPherson and that they hid the evidence from the police? I don't know if I really want to believe that. I think it's just pure negligence. I just think that they probably, didn't realize it. They're like, nah, he's fine. Whatever. He's coming back. Da-da-da-da-da. Oh, we think all the snowboards are turned in. All right, good enough. I honestly think that that's what happened. I think that there'd be a lot more moving parts if the ski resort were to completely try to cover this up and then hide it from the police and everything like that. So I don't think that there's some large conspiracy or cover-up going on from the Stubai Ski Resort. I just think that it was negligence on all the fronts. It's negligence on the police for not investigating further. It's negligence on the ski resort for not making sure that the mountain was clear before they took people down there, or took the snowcat drivers down there. I think it was negligence on probably behalf of the snowcat driver being probably impaired or just not seeing Duncan because of the ski conditions. I think everybody was negligent in this case, from the ski rental shop people, from the snowcat driver to the police. Everybody took this very, very neglected, and it's kind of very tough because we do see cases like this. We've covered a few cases like this on the show before, where it seems like every single step of the way when it comes to an investigation or pieces of the story are botched and they're neglected, and evidence is destroyed or hidden or lost or whatever it may be. And it's very, very unfortunate. However, I think the truth is that Duncan had met his unfortunate demise through a sheer accident, more likely than not, from the snowcat driver. And it is unfortunate that that's not the official story, because like I mentioned, the injuries are very, very consistent with that. And while that is not the official explanation, I fully believe that that is what happened here. I am so sure, in fact, this is probably the most sure that you're ever going to hear me in regards to a theory, at least the way that I've felt about a theory in a long time, because there is significant evidence to back up this theory about what happened to Duncan MacPherson. However, again, this is a very sad story. Palate cleanser, yes, but a sad story about a young man who seemingly had a promising career ahead of him, was derailed through injuries, was trying to basically reinvent himself and reinvent a different part of himself for a career, and he never got the chance to do that. And again, the story is very sad and very unfortunate. However, I found the story very fascinating and very compelling, and I felt like it was a very good episode to cover for this week, especially considering, we have so much snow now. I have to imagine skiing and snowboarding is great. Just please get off the mountain when they close. But with that being said, that's going to do it for me on this week's episode over the disappearance and death of Duncan MacPherson. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed me not talking about Mothman for the first time in 4 to 5 weeks. And again, I hope you all enjoyed today's episode. But with that all being said, I will see you all on the next one.